There's a moment, and I know this sounds strange, but stay with me. There's a moment right before everything changes when the world gets very, very quiet. Not peaceful quiet. Not the kind of quiet you feel at the end of a long day when you kick your boots off and sit on the porch with something warm in your hands. I mean the kind of quiet where your body knows something your brain hasn't processed yet. Where the hairs on your arms stand up for no reason you can name. Where your chest gets tight and your breathing slows down and some ancient part of you, some part that remembers being small and soft in a big dangerous world, just knows. I felt that quiet in Sector 7 of the Halcyon Station, docking bay about 6 years ago. And I wasn't the only one. Let me back up. Most people who haven't spent time on a joint operations station don't fully understand what those places are. You hear Galactic Coalition Station, and your brain fills in whatever picture it's got, maybe something clean and white from a movie, maybe something gritty and crowded from a news report. Neither one is quite right. Halcyon Station was the kind of place that existed because it had to, not because anyone loved it, not because anyone planned it with pride or care. It existed because the war, and I'll call it that, even though the coalition officially called it a conflict of territorial interest. Right up until it wasn't. The war had left so many holes in so many systems that humans and 36 alien species had to figure out how to share space with each other whether they liked it or not. And most of them didn't like it, not at first. The station was big. Big enough that you could walk for 40 minutes and never pass the same species twice. Big enough that there were sections where the gravity was adjusted, sections where the atmosphere had different ratios, sections where the lighting ran at frequencies humans couldn't really see in. There were translation nodes on every corridor junction, little humming boxes mounted near the ceiling that processed language in real time and fed it into everyone's comm implants. They worked about 80% of the time. The other 20%, you figured it out with hand gestures and patience, and the occasional misunderstanding that ended either in laughter or a standoff, depending on who was involved. I was assigned to Halcyon as a medical liaison. My job was essentially to make sure humans and non-humans could get treated in the same facilities without anyone dying because of a paperwork failure or a metabolic assumption. Boring, mostly. Important, always. The kind of job where you went weeks feeling like you were stamping forms, and then one day you kept someone alive because you knew that Dravathi bodies process analgesics differently, and the nurse on duty didn't. I'd been there for 2 years by the time this happened. 2 years was long enough to know the rhythms of the station. Long enough to know which corridors got busy at what hours, which docking bays had the bad lighting, which species liked which temperature, and which individuals, out of the thousands moving through that station, were the ones worth paying attention to. Corporal Yenna Vasquez was one of them. I want to be careful about how I describe Yenna because she was a real person, and I want to get her right. She was not the kind of person who made a big first impression. She wasn't tall. She wasn't loud. She didn't walk into a room and take it over the way some military people do, that thing where they enter and you feel the air pressure change. Yenna was compact and quiet, and she moved like someone who had learned a long time ago to take up exactly as much space as she needed, and not 1 centimeter more. She was from somewhere in central Texas originally, though you'd never hear her say that with any pride or any embarrassment either. It was just a fact about her the way height is a fact. She had short-cropped dark hair that she kept brutally neat and brown eyes that were, I'm searching for the right word here, steady. That's the word. Steady in a way that's rare. The kind of steady that isn't emptiness. She was paying attention constantly, you could feel it, but she never seemed reactive. She just took things in. She'd been assigned to Halcyon as part of a human-alien joint flight unit, one of the experimental programs the Coalition was running to test interspecies operational integration. The idea was that human pilots and alien pilots would train together, fly together, eventually trust each other enough to actually fight together if it came to that. On paper, it was a beautiful idea. In practice, it was complicated in ways the people who wrote the paper hadn't anticipated. Her assigned partner, her co-pilot in the joint program, was a Villari named Soren Ithel. Now the Villari. I need to explain the Villari because they are central to everything that follows, and most people's understanding of them is shaped by either coalition propaganda or anti-coalition propaganda, and both of those are wrong in different ways. The Villari are one of the oldest spacefaring species in the current known region. They've been traveling the stars for something like 4,000 years by human reckoning. They are physically elegant in a way that reads almost painful to human eyes, long-limbed, long-fingered, with facial structures that are bilaterally symmetrical in ways human faces aren't quite, and a bioluminescent quality to their skin that shifts slightly with their emotional state. Not enough to be obvious unless you know what to look for, a kind of shimmer, a deepening of the base color. If you spend enough time with them, you start to read it the way you read micro-expressions on a human face. They are also, and this is the part that caused problems, a species with a very particular cultural relationship to death and to loyalty. In Villari culture, and I'm simplifying here, there is a concept that doesn't translate perfectly but comes out in standard as something like the debt of witness. The idea is that if you are present when someone makes a sacrifice, when someone gives up something real, something that costs them, you are bound by that witnessing. You can't unknow it. You carry the shape of it. And if that sacrifice was made for you or for something you value, then you carry it in a specific way that's almost ceremonial. You are changed by having seen it. They didn't have a lot of respect for humans when we first made contact. That's the honest truth. 4,000 years of interstellar civilization gives you a certain amount of justified confidence, and humans, loud, messy, short-lived, emotionally chaotic humans, didn't exactly arrive in the galaxy cutting an impressive figure. We showed up with second-generation faster-than-light drives at a time when the Villari were already on their 9th generation. We showed up with 160 different governments that could barely agree on trade law. We showed up picking fights with 3 species simultaneously in our first decade of contact, mostly by accident, and had to be diplomatically rescued by the coalition twice before we'd been out here 5 years. The Villari were polite about it. Villari are almost always polite. But there was a quality to their politeness that translated if you were paying attention to something like patient contempt. They were waiting for us to catch up, or to fail. They hadn't decided which yet. Soren Ithel had been one of the more outspoken voices in the Villari pilot corps about the joint program. Not violently opposed, not causing scenes, but his position was on record. He didn't see the point of training with humans. Human reflexes were slower. Human decision-making under pressure was more emotionally compromised. Human bodies were fragile in ways that created tactical liabilities. He had delivered this opinion in the dry, precise language of a Villari field officer, and it had been noted and overruled, and he had accepted the assignment without complaint because that's what you did. He and Yenna had been flying together for about 4 months by the time everything happened. I'd seen them together around the station occasionally. They weren't unfriendly. They'd clearly arrived at a functional working relationship. You could see it in the way they moved through briefings, the way they shared maps and tactical displays, the way they handed things to each other without looking. There was a language between them that 2 people develop when they spend enough hours in a small cockpit, trusting each other with their lives whether they want to or not. But it was professional, careful, both of them keeping a certain amount of space. I don't know what they actually thought of each other by that point. I think Yenna respected him. She wasn't the type to disrespect someone who was good at their job, and Soren was exceptional. And I think he had started to revise something quietly over those 4 months. I think she had surprised him in some way he hadn't fully processed yet. But I didn't know any of that then. I only know it now, looking back, reading the spaces between the things that happened next. The day everything changed started as a training run. Sector 7 docking bay. 6:30 in the morning station time, which means the lighting was still in that artificial pre-dawn setting, this yellowish dim that made everything look like a photograph from another era. The bay smelled like it always smelled, recycled air with an undertone of fuel compounds, and the particular metallic cold of exposed hull plating. There were a handful of ground crew moving around, checking systems, running pre-flight protocols. A few other pilots from different programs. The ambient noise of a working bay, things beeping, things hissing, the low thrum of the station's power systems underneath everything. I was there because I had a morning check-in with one of the flight medics. Routine stuff. I wasn't there for Yenna or Soren or anything to do with their mission. I just happened to be there. I was talking to the medic. Her name was Priya. She was from Mumbai. She made exceptional tea somehow with limited materials. When one of the ground crew walked past us fast, and then another one, and I registered that something was happening in the direction of Bay 7C, but I didn't think much of it yet. Then Priya looked up, and her expression changed. "What is that?" she said. I turned. Soren was coming down the walkway from 7C's access corridor, and he was not moving right. Even from distance, 50 meters, maybe 60, you could see it. His gait was wrong. The Villari have this particular way of moving that's hard to describe, except to say it looks like they're slightly ahead of the space they're occupying, like their body knows where it's going a fraction of a second before it gets there. Fluid, economical. When that pattern breaks, it breaks obviously. Soren was moving like someone fighting something invisible, one hand on the corridor wall, each step placed with visible concentration. I was moving before I'd made a decision to move. Up close, it was worse. His bioluminescence was doing something I hadn't seen before. Not shifting, cycling, like a signal trying to stabilize. Fast flickers of color across his skin that his body was clearly trying to suppress and couldn't fully manage. His breathing was audible in a way it shouldn't be. His eyes, Villari eyes, are very dark, almost fully pupil, with a thin ring of color, were unfocused in a way that meant he was probably dealing with some form of neurological event. "Ithel," I stepped directly in front of him. "Stop, look at me." He stopped, he looked at me. For a second the focus wasn't there, and then it came back partly. "Medical officer," he said. His voice was controlled, very controlled, the kind of controlled that costs something. He paused, took a breath. "I am experiencing some difficulty." "Yeah," I said. "I can see that, don't move." I pulled my scanner. The readings came back fast and they scared me. His neural pressure was elevated in a pattern consistent with a Villari-specific condition called Veth cascade, basically a neurological spiral where the brain's navigational pathways, which are more complex and active in Villari than in humans, start feeding back on themselves. It's not a condition I'd treated personally before, but I had the files. I knew what it looked like. I knew what it did if you let it progress. It meant he absolutely could not fly. "You're grounded," I said. "Right now, this is not negotiable." "We have a training window," he said. "I understand that. The calibration run for the new drive system is scheduled for." "I understand that," I said again, firmer, "and it's not happening today, not with you. We need to get you to medical and get this under control." He closed his eyes, just for a second, and I saw something on his face, not quite frustration, because frustration is a human word, but something adjacent to it. Something that looked like a person doing math and not liking the answer. "I'll go to medical," he said. "The calibration run needs to be rescheduled." I was already on my comm to the flight coordinator. "This is Medical Liaison Chen, badge 744 Alpha. I'm grounding Villari pilot Soren Ithel, 7C flight unit, effective immediately. Medical grounds. Please log and notify the program coordinator." Logged, the coordinator's voice came back. "I'll notify." Wait, that was Yenna's voice. I turned. She had come out of Bay 7C at some point. I hadn't seen her arrive, and was standing about 10 feet away. She'd clearly been doing pre-flight because she was in her full flight suit, helmet tucked under one arm, and she had that look she sometimes got where her face went very still while she was thinking. "What's the calibration run for?" she asked. The coordinator's voice answered from my comm because the channel was still open. "New drive alignment test. The 7C unit has a modified spatial array installed yesterday. It needs a calibration flight before the array can be cleared for combat use. Failure to run the calibration within the next 18 hours results in the array resetting, and the installation process starts over." 26 hours of installation work, Soren said quietly. He'd straightened up against the wall, still clearly not well, but pulling his professionalism around himself like armor. "And the unit falls behind program timeline." Yenna looked at him, then she looked at me, then back at him. "Can it be flown single?" she asked. Silence for a moment. "The calibration run," the coordinator said. "Technically, the modified array needs the full sequence, 16 waypoints, spatial variance testing, the works. It's a 2-hour flight minimum, but the system just needs a qualified pilot and a functional cockpit. It's designed to run automated after launch. The pilot's mostly just monitoring and manual correction if something flags." "I'm qualified," Yenna said. Corporal Soren started. "I've logged 40 hours in this specific frame," she said. She wasn't arguing exactly. She was just placing facts in front of him the way you'd place cards on a table. I know the modified array config. I reviewed the installation specs yesterday because you asked me to cross-check the technician's work. A beat. I can fly it. A 2-hour solo calibration flight in a modified frame that hasn't been tested yet, I said. That's what a calibration flight is, she said, in a tone that was not unkind but was very clear about finding the observation unnecessary. She looked at Soren again, and something passed between them. I don't know exactly what. It was in a language I didn't speak, built from 4 months of small moments I hadn't witnessed. But I saw him look at her for a long time, and I saw his bioluminescence do something different, something steadier. The waypoints are loaded, he said finally. Into nav system. You'll need to manually verify the array alignment at waypoints 4 and 12. The technician's calibration gauge on the starboard coupling is reading .3 low. Compensate for it. She nodded like he'd told her the weather. I'll do the pre-flight checks, she said, and she turned and walked back into Bay 7C. I stayed with Soren while we waited for the medical transport. He didn't say anything for a while. He watched the bay entrance where Yenna had disappeared, and the bioluminescence across his face did its subtle, private thing that I was only beginning to learn to read. She doesn't have to do that, he said. Not to me exactly, more to the air. No, I agreed. She wants to. He was quiet again. She is, he paused, started over. Human pilots are often described in Velari training materials as high-variance operators, meaning that their performance range is wide, highly affected by emotional state, by fatigue, by the particular circumstances of a given moment. A Velari pilot's performance is more consistent, more predictable. Okay, I said. The training materials are not wrong, he said, as a general description, but they are another pause. Incomplete. The medical transport arrived then, and I went with him to medical, and I didn't see what happened next with my own eyes. I heard about it later, from 3 different sources. Priya, who was at the bay entrance when it happened. A ground technician named Vorel Drevathi, been on station 8 years, very steady, not given to exaggeration. And eventually from Yenna herself, though her version was the shortest and the hardest to get, and she gave it to me in pieces over several weeks. The calibration run launched at 7:42 station time. By 8:19, Halcyon's tracking system had flagged an anomaly. The modified spatial array, the one that hadn't been fully tested, the one the calibration flight was specifically meant to evaluate, had developed a feedback loop in its tertiary coupling. This was the coupling that the technician's gauge had been reading slightly off. The .3 variance that Soren had mentioned. What the variance had been hiding was a microfracture in the coupling housing. Under standard operation, undetectable. Under the specific stress conditions of the calibration sequence, it became, rapidly, a significant problem. The array didn't fail all at once. That's not how these systems fail. It degraded. Over about 11 minutes, the tertiary coupling's feedback loop began affecting the secondary coupling, and the secondary coupling began affecting the ship's primary navigation system, and the primary navigation system began affecting the flight computer. And by the time the ship's systems were generating active warnings, not anomaly flags, but actual emergency warnings. Yenna was already 37,000 kilometers from Halcyon Station, with a navigation system that was giving her 3 different and contradictory readings of her own position, and a spatial array that was oscillating between locked and not locked in a way that made faster-than-light jump impossible. She couldn't navigate home. She couldn't jump. And the oscillation in the array was generating a resonance in the hull plating that the flight computer was projecting would reach structural threshold in. It varies by account, but the computer's log said approximately 94 minutes. She had an hour and a half before the ship started coming apart. Now, I want to make sure you understand the environment here, because I think people sometimes hear this story with a kind of gloss over the physical reality of it. 37,000 kilometers is not far in interstellar terms. It is very far in human terms. It is a distance where the radio communication delay is measurable in tenths of seconds. It is a distance where, if you are in a small ship and the ship is experiencing structural degradation, you are alone in a way that is almost total. You cannot see the station with your eyes. You cannot feel anything except the ship around you and the space outside it. Your world has contracted to your cockpit and your screens and whatever your own mind is doing to fill the space. Yenna's mind, based on the records, was doing something very specific. It was working the problem. The communications logs from her ship during that period I've read them, they are remarkable documents. Not because they're dramatic, because they're not. They are almost aggressively methodical. She was talking to Halcyon's emergency flight coordinators, relaying system readings, testing response protocols, running through every potential fix in sequence. She was not panicking. She was not catastrophizing. She was working through the problem the way you'd work through a checklist, one item at a time with the same voice you'd use ordering lunch. But the problem didn't have a solution in the checklist. The array feedback couldn't be stopped remotely. The navigation conflict couldn't be resolved without the array. And the hull resonance was progressing on its own timeline regardless of what anyone wanted. At 8:47, the flight coordinator told her, and I'm paraphrasing from the log, that their assessment was that the ship could not be saved and that she should evaluate ejection options. Ejection in this context meant the emergency pod, single-occupant survival capsule located in the aft section. It would separate from the main ship, emit a distress beacon, and float until pickup. The pod's beacon had a range of about 50,000 kilometers. Halcyon was within range. Rescue would have found her within 90 minutes. She said she'd noted the option and would continue working the problem. The coordinator said something like, "Corporal, the ship is going to be lost." She said she understood. He said, "The window for pod ejection is time-sensitive." She said she understood. And she kept working. At 8:51, a second voice entered the channel. Soren Ithel had arrived in Halcyon's Emergency Coordination Center, despite being in the middle of a medical treatment that had been, by all accounts, going well enough that the attending physician was unhappy to see him stand up and remove the monitoring leads and put his uniform back on. I can only imagine the conversation that resulted. I know the Velari physician on duty. Her name is Dr. Keithais. She's been practicing for 60 years. She is not easily impressed or easily ignored. But she let him go. I asked her about it later and she said, and this is characteristic of her, she said, he wasn't going to stay. And his vital signs, while concerning, had stabilized enough that continued treatment was management, not emergency. And I have been practicing medicine for 60 years, and I know what a person looks like when they are where they need to be. He needed to be there. So, Soren in the coordination center, which was already crowded with Halcyon's emergency response team, 3 senior flight coordinators, and because Halcyon's command structure was what it was, 2 Velari fleet officers who had been passing through the station and had gotten pulled into the situation. One of them was Admiral Tessara Vale. I need you to understand who Admiral Tessara Vale was, and I need you to understand it not through her rank or her record, though both are substantial. I need you to understand her through the way the room changed when she walked into it. She was not large. She was not loud. She was around 340 years old by human reckoning, which for Velari put her somewhere in early middle age, the equivalent of maybe your mid-40s in human terms, though that's a rough translation of a very different biological reality. She had the coloring of elder Velari, deeper base tone, a bioluminescence that ran silver-adjacent in neutral states. She had spent most of her life in fleet command, and she had the quality that comes from that, not just confidence but something more specific, a kind of settled authority that doesn't need to announce itself. She had also been one of the architects of the Joint Pilot Program, one of the actual believers in it, as opposed to the political supporters who thought it was useful optics. She believed, genuinely, that the program could build something real between species that had every historical reason to distrust each other. But she had been careful about that belief, precise. She kept it in its box. She was not a person who let things break through her professional surface. She came into the coordination center and took in the situation in about 10 seconds, and then quietly moved to a position where she could see all the screens without being in anyone's way. Soren got on the channel. Vasquez, just her name. His voice was steady. Most of the people in the room who didn't know him wouldn't have heard anything unusual. But the communications log is good quality, and I've listened to it many times since, and what I hear under the steadiness is something thin, something controlled so hard it's almost white. Ithel, and the thing about Yenna's voice, she'd clearly identified the voice before he spoke his name, just from the calm signature or maybe just because she knew him well enough to know the pattern of how he opened a channel. There was something in the single word, not relief exactly, something else. "Tell me where you are in the diagnostic sequence," he said. "I'm past the diagnostic sequence," she said. "The array's gone. Tertiary coupling housing failure propagated to secondary. Navigation conflict is total. I've been working the hull resonance, but there's nothing to dampen it with. The ship's dampening system is tied to the spatial array, and—" "I know," he said. "I read the specs." "Then you know the math." "I know the maths," he agreed. Silence for a moment. Just the sound of the ship's background noise through the channel, that particular hum of a hull under stress. "Eject," he said. "I'm not done," she said. "Vasquez." "The navigation conflict has 3 active contradictory signals," she said. "If I can isolate which one is reading correctly, even one, I can use it to get close enough to Halcyon for their long-range tow. I need about 20 more minutes." "The hull resonance." "I know, I'm tracking it. If it reaches the forward coupling at current rate." "I know. I said I'm tracking it." He stopped. You could feel him stopping, the specific quality of a person making a choice about how hard to push. "What do you need?" he said. And she told him. What followed was, I've described it to people before, and they look at me like I'm embellishing, and I promise I'm not. It was extraordinary. Soren walked her through a navigation isolation process that technically existed in the flight manual, but that hadn't been implemented practically, because it required simultaneous manipulation of 7 separate system variables, most of which were designed to be automated. It was the kind of procedure you'd maybe attempt if you'd been flying this specific ship for years, and had the reflex memory for all 7 controls simultaneously. It was not the kind of thing you walked someone through on a live channel, with a degrading hull and 90 minutes on the clock. He walked her through it. Not fast, not slow, sentence by sentence. "Check this, confirm that, when this reading stabilizes tell me, wait, yes, now adjust this coupling to 0.7, no, don't touch the secondary until, wait for it now." And she followed him, step for step, asking when she needed to ask, confirming when she needed to confirm, making the adjustments she was told to make with the same unshakable steadiness she'd had since 742 when the whole thing started. Around them, the coordination center was silent except for the sounds of people doing their jobs, but they were all listening. Every person in that room was listening to the channel, the way you listen to something when you understand that it matters. Admiral Tessara Vale stood near the back and said nothing and watched the screens. At 9:31, Yenna said, "I've got one. Navigation signal 3 is consistent with known reference points. The other 2 are artifacts of the array failure." On the room's tracking screen, a data point that had been flickering uncertain for 40 minutes resolved and steadied. Her position. People made sounds, not cheers, just sounds. The sounds people make when something very tight and very painful slowly loosens. "Confirmed from our end," the coordinator said, and his voice cracked slightly on the second word and he cleared his throat. "We've got you on primary tracking." "Can you tow at this distance?" Yenna asked. "Working on it, stand by." The number that came back was not good. Halcyon's long-range tow system had a functional maximum of 31,000 kilometers. She was at 37. She had to get closer. And the hull resonance, which had been their constant background threat through this whole thing, was now showing acceleration. The degrading coupling was pulling heat, and the heat was feeding the resonance, and the resonance was now running ahead of the timeline they'd been working from. New estimate, 43 minutes. "I need to cover 6,000 kilometers in 43 minutes, Yenna said. Her voice was the same. It was the same voice she'd used for everything. "What am I working with for thrust?" The answer was not straightforward. The navigation conflict had been partially resolved, but the ship's thruster array was drawing from the same power distribution network as the spatial array, and the array's failure state was causing irregular power draw that was making thrust unreliable. She had maybe 60% of normal thrust capacity, delivered unevenly. 6,000 kilometers with unreliable thrust and a deteriorating hull. "What's the math?" she asked. The coordinator ran it. "Marginal," he said finally. "You'd need to maintain direction without navigation assistance. Use the visual reference points we'll transmit, and you'd need the hull to hold to the current resonance rate. If it accelerates further, what's the ejection window? His pause answered her before his words did. If you eject now, pod only, you're within beacon range. We send a rescue shuttle. 78 minutes you're aboard. And if I wait 30 minutes? Silence. The hull stress on the pod's housing, Soren said quietly. He hadn't left the channel. He was there. If the main hull resonance propagates to the aft section before ejection, the pod housing may be compromised. So the window closes, she said. It's closing now, he said. Silence again, different from the earlier silences, heavier. Vasquez, the coordinator said, we recommend immediate ejection. Noted, she said. And then she was quiet for a long moment. And the screens in the coordination center showed her position, and the resonance readings, and the distance gap, and all the math that everyone in the room was doing the same way she was doing it. You know what, she said, and something in her voice had changed. Not the control was still there, but there was something underneath it that was more human, more Yenna, something that sounded like her deciding something at depth. I'm going to try for it. In the coordination center, you could have heard a pin drop. Vasquez, the coordinator, started. I know the risks, she said. I know the window. I need visual reference points transmitted in the next 3 minutes. I'm going to use the thruster array in short burns. I've been watching the pattern, the unreliable draws are cycling. I can work with the cycles. I need the reference points, and I need someone on this channel to call time on me. She paused. Ithel, she said, will you call time? And the room, without realizing it, the whole room turned to look at Soren. He was standing very still. He was looking at the tracking screen. The bioluminescence across his face was doing something I'd never seen before and haven't seen since. It wasn't cycling, it wasn't flickering, it was burning. Steady and bright, and there isn't really a word for the color. Something between gold and silver. Something that in Velari chromatic language meant something I didn't have the vocabulary for yet. Yes, he said, I'll call time. What happened in the next 31 minutes is a matter of record. The coordination center has the full log, the tracking data, every communication, every thruster burn, every hull resonance reading. I'm going to tell you what I know from the record and what Yenna told me in pieces afterward, and what I've assembled from those and from being there in the room, watching it happen. The visual reference points went out to her at 9:36. She acknowledged them at 9:37. The first thruster burn happened at 9:38, and it was not quite right. The power draw spiked in a way that kicked her off the ideal trajectory by about 2 degrees. 2 degrees port, Soren said. No alarm, just information. She corrected. There was a pause in the burn while she watched the power cycles. You could almost see her doing it, watching the numbers, feeling the rhythm. Then the second burn and the third, and these ones were right. Not perfect, but close enough. On the tracking screen, her position marker began to move. Slowly, agonizingly slowly by the scale of space, but moving. The hull resonance did not stay cooperative. At the 9-minute mark, something in the coupling sequence failed, not catastrophically, but enough that the resonance jumped to a new rate. The math changed. Her margin got thinner. Soren called it out. Not the fact that it got worse, she could see that on her own screens. He called the new numbers. New distance needed, new time to hull threshold, new calculations, immediate and precise, so she didn't have to run them and fly at the same time. She burned, she corrected. She asked him twice to check her math on the thruster cycle pattern, and he checked it and gave it back to her, and once he caught something she'd missed, and once she was right, and he told her she was right. The distance closed. 37,000 kilometers. 35,200. 33,800. The resonance hit another threshold. The timeline jumped. Now 22 minutes before the hull stress made the pod housing question mark. Ejection window closing. Vasquez, Soren said, and his voice was as steady as hers, as steady as it had been through the whole thing. Current rate, you'll be in tow range in 19 minutes. Hull threshold for pod ejection, 16. She already knew. 3 minutes, she said. Yes. If I hit a power cycle problem, if one of the burns goes wrong. You'll need to eject immediately, he said. Without warning, go straight to the pod. And if I don't get in tow range? Yenna, he used her first name. The first time in the record in 41 minutes of communication that he'd used her first name. If you don't get in tow range and the hull goes, you eject. You eject regardless, you understand. A beat, the smallest beat. I understand, she said. Say it, he said, clearly. And I think this is the thing. I think this is the moment that is the center of everything, the moment I keep coming back to, the one that I've thought about in the years since. Because he was asking her to promise him something. Not the coordinator, not Fleet Command, not Halcyon Station. Him. And the reason he needed her to promise, the reason his voice had changed, fractionally, on those last words, was because he needed to know she would. If I don't make tow range and the hull goes, Yenna said clearly, I eject, I promise. Thank you, he said. And then they went back to work. At 9:59, Yenna's ship crossed 31,000 kilometers. The tow beam locked at 0959-43. The hull resonance reached pod housing compromise threshold at 1001-17. 1 minute and 34 seconds to spare. The tow pulled her in at slow, careful speed with Halcyon's engineering team managing the resonance as best they could. They couldn't stop it, but they could slow it enough. The ship came apart, as it was always going to come apart, about 12,000 kilometers out from the station. But by then Yenna was in the tow beam, and the beam held her cockpit section stable, and the rest of it peeled away into salvage debris, and she sat in the cockpit and waited to come home. When the coordination center's screens showed the tow lock, the room. I was there. I was standing near the door because I'd arrived in the middle of the sequence, pulled there by Priya who'd come to get me with this look on her face, and I'd stood in the back and watched the last 17 minutes of it. When the tow locked, the room made noise. Real noise. People were shouting, not in alarm, but in the release of something that had been held very tightly for too long. The coordinator made a sound that was part laugh, part something else, and hit his console with both palms. Vorel, the Dravathi ground tech who never showed anything, put his head down on the console for a moment and breathed. Two of the junior officers grabbed each other's arms. I was watching Soren. He didn't make noise. He didn't move, not for several seconds. He was looking at the tracking screen, and the bioluminescence across his face was still doing that thing, that burning gold-silver thing. And then he put one hand flat on the console in front of him and took a very long, very slow breath. And then I was watching Admiral Tessara Vale. Because I wasn't the only one watching Soren. The Admiral had been watching him through the last 17 minutes, had watched his voice, had watched the way he called the numbers and the adjustments and the time markers, had watched him say Yenna's name, had watched him need her to promise. She was standing very still, and the expression on her face. The Velari are not, this is a common misconception, the Velari are not emotionally muted. They're not cold. They have inner lives that are as complex and as deep as anything you'd find in any species I've encountered. But their emotional culture is private, layered. They show you what they choose to show you, and in formal or professional contexts, what they show you is very little. Admiral Tessara Vale had been standing in that coordination center for the better part of an hour, and she had been perfectly composed and professionally present and completely unreadable. She was not unreadable now. The bioluminescence across her face was doing something I had absolutely no vocabulary for. Not the gold-silver of Soren's tension and focus. Something deeper. Something that moved like water moves, slow and without interruption. A color that I can only describe by saying it looked like something that had been held back for a very long time. And there were, I am not embellishing this, and I have compared notes with 3 other people who were in that room, and they all say the same thing. There were tears on her face. Actual tears, running down quietly. She wasn't hiding them exactly, but she wasn't displaying them either. They were just there, the way things are when you're caught by something larger than your preparation for it. She was looking at Soren, and she was looking at the tracking screen where Yenna's ship was slowly coming home, and she was. I don't know exactly what she was feeling. I didn't know enough then. I know more now. But I think what Admiral Tessara Vale saw in that hour was the thing she'd been hoping for when she built the program, and the thing she'd been afraid to believe was real. Not the cooperation, not the technical performance, not the operational metrics the program was designed to generate. She'd seen enough of that. She'd seen interspecies cooperation done correctly, and done poorly, and done cynically, and done with varying degrees of sincerity. She saw something else. She saw what it looks like when a person refuses to leave someone behind. When a person does the math, looks at all the risk, looks at all the exits, and decides that the person they've flown beside for 4 months is worth going all the way to the edge for. And she saw what it looked like when that refusal wasn't just noticed but felt by someone who had 4,000 years of civilization behind him, and a theoretical framework for loyalty and sacrifice that was older than human writing. Felt by Soren, in a way that had changed something in him. You could see it in his face, and not just in a small way. She saw the debt of witness. And she understood, I think, that whatever she had hoped the program might build, this was it. Not a policy, not a treaty, not an operational framework. This. 2 people who had started as strangers and ended up in a cockpit together, and somewhere in the space between those 2 things had become something for which the Velari had a very specific word, and humans did not. Yenna came off the rescue transport at Halcyon's docking ring looking exactly the way you'd expect someone to look who'd spent 2.5 hours fighting a dying ship, tired, marked by it, wearing it in her face. But she was upright. She was herself. The docking area was crowded, more people than you'd expect for a single crew transfer. The word had gotten around the station the way words get around on stations, faster than any official channel. People had come to see. Soren was there. He'd been brought from the coordination center by someone. I don't know who authorized it. Probably no one did. He probably just walked. And he was standing near the docking ring entrance in his rumpled uniform with his medical leads still trailing from one sleeve that someone hadn't fully detached. And he looked like he'd been through something too, even though he'd been on a station the entire time. Yenna came through the docking ring, saw him. They looked at each other across about 15 feet of crowded corridor. And then she crossed the distance and she put her arms around him. A human gesture, not a Velari one. A human reaching for a Velari in public on a busy corridor with people watching. He hesitated 1 breath, maybe 2, and then his arms came around her, and he held on. The crowd around them, and I was in that crowd. I was standing close enough to see this clearly. The crowd went quiet in that specific way crowds go quiet when they're witnessing something that asks for quiet. Admiral Tessara Vale was standing at the edge of that crowd. She had come from the coordination center to the docking ring. Again, I don't know if anyone authorized this. She was a fleet admiral. Possibly she didn't need authorization. And she was standing there watching Yenna and Soren, and the tears that had started in the coordination center had not entirely stopped. She wasn't hiding them now. She made no attempt to hide them. She just stood and watched and let herself be present for it, this thing she'd hoped to build and hadn't entirely dared to believe in. 2 people from 2 civilizations with every reason to distrust each other, in each other's arms, because one of them had refused to leave, and the other had refused to let her go alone. After a long moment, maybe 30 seconds, maybe longer, Yenna pulled back just enough to look at him. "You called time," she said. "You asked me to," he said. "You stayed on the channel the whole time." He looked at her, and the bioluminescence did its thing, the gold-silver, but softer now, warmer. "Yes," he said, "of course." She nodded, like he'd confirmed something she'd already known. "The technician's gauge," she said. "0.3 low." "I know," he said. "We should write up the report together." "Yes," he said, "we should." And somehow the bureaucratic normalcy of it, the report, the ordinary procedural continuation of 2 working people who had just done something extraordinary, somehow that was exactly right. That was exactly them. Admiral Tessara Vale approached them after the crowd had started to disperse, after the medical team had done their cursory check on Yenna and confirmed she was intact and signed the forms, after the immediate noise of it had faded into the ambient sounds of a working station. She stood in front of them both and she took a moment, just a moment. She was composed again, not fully, not quite. There was still something in her face that hadn't gone back behind the professional surface, but composed enough. "Corporal Vasquez," she said. "Admiral," Yenna straightened. "You will receive a formal commendation," the Admiral said, "for the navigation isolation work alone. That procedure under those conditions was," she paused. "It was remarkable." "The procedure was Ithal's," Yenna said immediately. "I executed it, he built it." "On a live channel," the Admiral said, under time pressure for a pilot other than himself. She looked at Soren, something moved in her face. The commendation will reflect both contributions. Soren inclined his head. The Admiral was quiet for a moment. She looked at them both, and I think she was doing what she'd been doing in the coordination center, witnessing, carrying the shape of what she'd seen. I have been building the joint program for 6 years, she said finally. I have read reports, I have reviewed metrics, I have evaluated what interspecies operational integration means on paper and in practice. She paused again. Today was not a report. Neither of them said anything. What you did today, the Admiral said, and her voice was as steady and as precise as it always was except for the thing underneath it that you had to listen for, will be in the program's record, not as a case study, not as a metrics point. She looked at Yenna. As a definition. Then she looked at them both one more time. And she did something that I was told later was deeply unusual for a Velari of her rank and her generation. She reached out and placed one hand, briefly, on each of their shoulders. A contact gesture. Deliberate and chosen. Rest, she said, both of you. And she walked away down the corridor. I caught up with Yenna 2 days later in the station's small cafeteria section that served what passed for real food. She was eating something that was only approximately a sandwich and writing the incident report on a tablet. She looked rested, mostly. I sat down across from her with my own coffee, and she looked up and gave me that steady look of hers. You want to ask something, she said. When the coordinator told you to eject, I said, you said you'd noted the option. Why didn't you take it? She thought about it for a moment, took a bite of her sandwich, looked out at the corridor. The ship wasn't done, she said. The ship was lost, I said, technically. The ship wasn't done, she repeated. There was still a thing to try. She paused. I don't leave things with a thing still to try. I can't explain it better than that. You risked your life on a thing to try. Yeah, she said, simple, not defensive. I did. Was it worth it? She looked at me. The ship's gone, she said. The calibration didn't complete. The array's debris somewhere in Sector 7, so in terms of the mission, no, complete failure. She took another bite. In terms of something else, she stopped. I don't know how to measure that. I just know that it would have mattered if I'd ejected early. It would have mattered to me, and I think it would have mattered to Ithel. Why? I asked. She was quiet for a long moment. Because he stayed on that channel for 2.5 hours, she said. And you don't do that. A Velari doesn't do that, not publicly, not in a coordination center full of senior officers and fleet command. You don't do that for someone you're just flying with professionally. You do that for... She paused, and for the first time in that conversation she looked like she was looking for words and not finding exactly the right ones. You do that for someone who matters. And that kind of thing, that kind of showing deserves to be met, you know. I thought about that for a long time afterward. I thought about it when I heard, 6 months later, that Soren Ithel had submitted a formal request to extend his joint program assignment beyond its scheduled end date. The extension was for 1 year. It was approved. I thought about it when I heard, a year after the incident, that Admiral Tessara Vale had used the Vasquez-Ithel calibration incident as the centerpiece of her address to the Coalition's Interspecies Integration Council. Not the technical aspects of the incident. Not the navigation isolation procedure or the hull resonance timeline or any of the operational details. She had talked about the choice, about staying. About the thing that it means to a civilization, to any civilization, when someone refuses to calculate their own safety above the thing they owe the person beside them. I heard that when she got to a certain part of the address, she paused for a long moment and the room waited. And she said, I saw something that day that I did not have the language for, and I still do not have adequate language for it. What I saw was the shape of what we can become if we choose it. Not cooperation, not alliance, not operational integration, something older and harder and more true than any of those, something that does not require a treaty. I thought about the tears on her face in the coordination center, about the way she'd watched Yenna walk through the docking ring and into Soren's arms, about the way she'd touched their shoulders, that chosen, deliberate contact, before she walked away. I thought about Soren saying Yenna for the first time after 41 minutes of calling her Vasquez. I thought about what it means to stay on the channel. I've been asked to tell this story a few times now. At panels, in briefings, once in a deposition for the Incident Review Board that eventually led to a comprehensive overhaul of how calibration flights were staffed and supervised. I tell it the same way every time because that's how it happened, and there's no version that's better than the true one. People always ask the same few questions. Was Yenna afraid? I honestly don't know. She's never answered that one to my satisfaction. She says things like you manage what you can manage and fear is data. You use it, and I think those things are true, but I also think she felt something in that cockpit that 2 hours and 37,000 kilometers from the nearest human being is hard to not feel, and she just didn't let it make her decisions. Did Soren know she was going to be okay? Also no. The math in that coordination center was not comfortable math. There were people in that room who were preparing themselves for bad news and doing it the whole time. He knew the math as well as anyone. He stayed on the channel anyway. What was the Admiral crying about? This one I've thought about the most. I think, and this is just my read of it, I think she cried because she'd spent 6 years trying to build something that the program's critics said was impossible. That you couldn't get alien species who'd been wary of each other for decades to genuinely care about each other. You could get cooperation, compliance, professional courtesy. You couldn't manufacture the thing underneath that. The thing that makes a person refuse to leave. The thing that makes another person stay on the channel until there's nothing left to stay for. She thought it was impossible to build. And then she was in a room watching it be real, and she was watching it be real in a way that surprised even her, and I think the tears were the overflow of 6 years of hoping and doubting and building anyway. Or maybe it was simpler than that. Maybe it was just the thing it always is when you see someone refuse to give up on someone else. The simple, human, or velari, or whatever the word is that means both, the simple recognition that this is what it is supposed to look like. This is what we're supposed to do for each other. Maybe she cried because she recognized it, and she hadn't known how much she'd needed to see it until it was right there in front of her. The last time I saw Yenna and Soren together was about 8 months after the incident. They were in the hangar bay, the newly completed Bay 7C replacement, rebuilt after the investigation, and they were doing pre-flight on a new ship. The new joint program frame, properly tested, properly certified. They were moving around it in that way they had. The language built from 4 months and then 8 months, and now close to a year of knowing exactly where the other one was going to be. He was reading her something from a systems check. She was 2/3 of the way up the boarding ladder, and she turned her head to answer him and said something I couldn't hear. He said something back, brief. She laughed, and the bioluminescence across his face did something warm. That's the image I carry, not the coordination center, not the docking ring, not the tears on an admiral's face, though I carry that too. I carry that laugh, that warm light, the ship ready behind them and the whole rest of their story still ahead. Sometimes I think about what loyalty actually is. Not the word is easy, but the substance of it. What it's actually made of when you strip away the sentiment and the poetry and the speeches given about it at dinners where everyone already agrees. I think it's something very small and very specific. It's the moment when the math says leave and you say not yet. It's the moment when no one would blame you for going and you stay. It's the moment when someone on the other end of a channel could have put the calm down hours ago and had every rational justification for it. And instead they say, I'll call time, and they call it minute by minute, all the way to the end. It doesn't matter what species you are. It doesn't matter how old your civilization is, or how advanced your technology, or how many generations of philosophy and culture you have behind you. When you see it, the real thing, the substance of it, you recognize it. Even an admiral who's seen 4,000 years of history recognizes it. And if you're watching it happen and it doesn't do something to you, if your eyes stay dry and your chest stays easy and you walk away unchanged, then I think you've missed something. I don't think many people in that coordination center walked away unchanged. I know I didn't. She didn't leave, he didn't let go. And somewhere between those two things, something was built that neither civilization had the words for, but both of them knew the moment they saw it that it was real.